Well, I want to thank everybody for coming today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mary Hall and I'm the Thurston County Auditor. One of the statutory duties of the auditor's office is recording deeds and land records. And, we think it's really important to acknowledge history. And, it hasn't been real pretty, not just in Thurston County, but across the country. And racially restrictive covenants are a really painful legacy of systemic discrimination that shaped the housing in Thurston County and really everywhere across the country. So they're not just legal barriers. I mean, there were social tools used for way too long in this country. And, these were ruled unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1948. And then the practice of redlining was explicitly unallowed by the state Supreme Court in 1968. Yet these restrictive covenants continued to be filed in our office, even though they were unenforceable for many years after they were ruled unenforceable in 1948. So what we're going to do today is talk a little about history and the research that's been done to kind of tackle this problem. So, I'm really proud of Emmett, who has led the effort in this program. And we offer a no-cost method for people to record a modifications, because currently, when they still exist on property titles and in covenants, they still move forward with transfer of ownership. So what a modification does is actually removes that going forward. It doesn't erase history, but it prevents it from moving forward, which I think is a really important step and an important statement. I'm really proud to say that Thurston County was the first in the state. In fact, are we still the only in the state?
Spokane does have
Okay.
well, I don't think King County is the county done.
The county hasn't done outreach, but there's been individual community groups.
So we took it upon ourselves to work to identify where these covenants existed in Thurston County. And we did a direct mail campaign. We did a lot of outreach to invite people in to file these modifications, because it was allowed beginning in 2019, but nobody was taking advantage of this program. So we started this program in 2021, and I'm happy to say there was funding through the legislature to enable University of Washington to really expand this research project to bring all of these parcels to light, so we could really attack this as a state. So I'm going to introduce Sophie Belz. She's a researcher with the University of Washington. They've got a pretty robust racially restrictive covenants project happening, so we're thrilled about that. And they've worked really hard to unearth thousands of these racially restrictive covenants. So she's going to talk about the lessons that we can learn from history. And I'm also honored to have Dr. Thelma Jackson, who many of you probably know. She is the chair of the New Life Baptist Church Community Engagement Ministry. And she's lived in Thurston County for her entire life. So she's going to speak a little. Is it your entire life? Not quite. Not quite. Almost her entire 54 years. So she's really felt these impacts, and she's going to talk a little bit about that, as well as the ongoing harm that these covenants are causing. So with that, Sophie, the floor is yours. Let's switch places.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all so much for having me. As I was introduced, my name is Sophie. I've been working on the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project up at UW in Seattle for the past 2.5 years. So I've done a lot of this research, looking through deeds, etc., as well as putting together kind of stories that tell what these covenants actually looked like in our communities and in different counties across the Puget Sound. Okay, and can I grab that for the slides? Or...
Yes. You want to drive? Yeah. We're just gonna hit the few bits again.
Scroll. Oh, I see what you mean.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So before, I'm gonna go over our topics. So this is the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project. The project initially began in 2005, so over 20 years ago is when these covenants started to be researched in this way. I'm going to tell you a bit more about how that started. Then we're going to talk about our data collection and mapping process, which is how we really visualize where these restrictions were. We're then going to talk about the local segregation history in Thurston County and King County, which goes far beyond racial restrictive covenants. Then we're going to talk about the eventual end of racial restrictive covenants, which wasn't actually until like 1968, and the legacy that they've left in our communities today in terms of generational wealth, homeownership, and just the welcomeness of non-white people in these communities. So before I get started on any of that, I just wanted to acknowledge all the incredible work that Dr. Thelma Jackson has done researching and documenting the experiences of Black residents in Thurston County. Her community album, which is shown on the screen, and I'm sure she'll talk more about, talks a lot more about the realities of life in Thurston County, from violent exclusionary racism in the 1950s through continuing expressions of racial exclusion and violence today. And her work has been an incredible tool for contextualizing the role of racial covenants within a much broader culture of white supremacy in Thurston County. So what are racial restrictive covenants? All of these covenants here on the screen are taken from property records in King County and Thurston County. This top one is a pretty prototypical restriction in Thurston County. Almost all of the restrictions in this county use the language you see here, which is extremely explicit. So racial restrictive covenants were legally enforceable clauses that were imposed on property deeds by owners and land developers, which bound them and all future owners of the property not to sell, lease, or rent their property to a specified racial or religious group. So this wasn't only racial, ethnic groups. This also could sometimes include different religious groups like Jewish people. We haven't found any explicit restrictions like that in Thurston County, but those are common in King County and some other counties. Unlike other forms of restriction, racial covenants not only blocked ownership, but all occupancy and land use, ultimately creating entire neighborhoods that were legally off limits to non-white people. These are all examples of restrictive covenants taken from property records in King and Thurston County, and we'll go into depth later about some of the language that was used, but right now, it's important to just take a look and realize how explicit these restrictions were. So as I said, the Covenants Project initially began 20 years ago in 2005 under the direction of Dr. James Gregory, who's a history professor there. In March 2021, SHB 1335 passed, and it tasked our project with identifying and mapping covenants in every county across Washington state. So this is a much larger effort than just King or Thurston County. Our team at the University of Washington handles all of the counties west of the Cascades, and then another team at Eastern Washington University handles everything to the east. In order to identify restrictive covenants, our team carefully sifts through property records for each county looking for restrictive language in the actual property deed. Many counties have no digital records, including Thurston County, so our team spends hours in the archives flipping through hundreds of volumes of bound deeds. You can see those pictures there. When we started the project, King County had only some of their over 1 million property deeds digitized, and knowing that that would not be feasible to look through by hand, our team spent months digitizing this microfilm. Once deeds are digitized, we use optical character recognition technology to search the documents for potentially restrictive language. Volunteers and research associates then verify these matches. So this is kind of what that looks like, and you would look through here and try to identify a restriction. We've had over 1,700 volunteers help us identify restrictions on Zooniverse, which is an online research platform, which allows anyone to get involved from the comfort of their home. So we've had students, law groups, community groups, libraries, et cetera, of people who just want to help with this research. So once we've identified and put into a spreadsheet all of the information for these properties, they are mapped. Our maps are all done by research associate Liz Pang. This is a screenshot of our map for Thurston County. So far, our team just at University of Washington for Western Washington has identified over 70,000 property restrictions, including 44,000 in King County alone, 7,000 in Snohomish County, which is north of King County, 8,000 in Cowlitz County, and more than 1,700 in Thurston County. This is an interactive map, and by going online to the covenant's website, you can explore it more. You can zoom in and look at the individual properties in any of these areas, read the covenants, see what year it was imposed, and see who restricted it. There's also other tools where you can see kind of the timing of restriction. You can also see who the most prominent developers who are restricting at that time were. And you can overlay with different demographic information from the Thurston County Census. It's important to note that restrictive covenants do not tell close to the entire story of racial restriction in Thurston County. These maps reflect the housing of timing development in the area. Across Washington, areas newly subdivided between 1926 and 1952 were the most likely to be restricted in their deeds. Our maps also reflect incomplete and ongoing research, and it is possible that we have not identified every restriction in the state or in the county. We're actually just getting new batches this week of additional restrictions in Thurston County. So what we have here is not everything that we have located so far. Areas without restrictive covenants were also often restricted by other means, including social harassment, violence, and the actions of real estate agents, neighbors, and law enforcement. So how did this practice become so widespread, not only in Thurston County and Washington, but across the entire United States? Beginning in the 1920s, the real estate industry conducted campaigns across the entire country to convince developers and property owners to register racially restrictive covenants. In 1926, the Supreme Court ruled in Corrigan v. Buckley that racist restrictions were both legal and enforceable. Until 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in their code of ethics against selling homes to people of color, claiming it would be detrimental to the property values in the neighborhood. And you can see that on the screen here. Most banks, loan companies, title companies, insurance companies, and real estate agents were closely affiliated with the real estate board and refused to underwrite mortgages for non-white people. Olympia Federal Savings and Loan, which is still located in downtown Olympia, is a good example of a prominent loan company that actively imposed restrictions on properties in the area. The bank opened in 1906, and in 1938, they restricted over 105 properties in Mountain View Addition to white residents only. And this really shows how these different industries, different powerful institutions that control finances, that control housing, have interconnecting impacts in Thurston County. So it's also important to clarify that racial restrictive covenants were distinct from other forms of racial housing discrimination, like redlining, which operated more in larger urban areas and were advised by the federal government. The image on the screen shows a map of Seattle produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1926 to advise federal mortgage lending. After the collapse of housing and lending industries during the Great Depression, millions of Americans lost their homes, and the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Authority, which granted new long-term mortgages to existing homeowners and subsidized new lending backed by government insurance. These developments transformed the United States into a homeowners nation, or at least a nation where most white families owned homes. Any neighborhood where Black or Asian people lived was deemed hazardous to lenders' investments, and it was colored red on these maps, hence the term redlining. Because of this designation, the Federal Housing Authority refused to underwrite mortgages and denied insurance to non-white families. This inability to access government mortgage assistance during the critical post-war period made it impossible for most non-white families to build generational wealth through housing appreciation. Black, Asian, and Indigenous families are still at a systemic disadvantage in achieving the stability of home ownership coveted by the American dream. While these maps were not created in smaller areas like Thurston County, patterns of segregation enforced by local residents are eerily similar. I'm now going to transition to talking a bit about racial segregation in Thurston County specifically. Tumwater and Olympia are built upon the legacy of violent, exploitative expulsion of native Squaxin and Nisqually people from their historical land under the Treaty of Medicine Creek. For generations, following a ubiquitous culture of white supremacy meant African Americans, Asian Americans, and Indigenous Americans were systemically harassed and shut out of neighborhoods, schools, occupations, churches, and even hospitals in the area. Thurston County still shows this history today. The article on the screen was written for the Mason County Journal in 1903, and illuminates the injustices faced by Squaxin tribal members as their native and accustomed tidelands were continuously sold off to colonial land purchasers, and they faced violence when trying to visit them. In 1885, Olympia residents prearranged a race riot against Chinese residents, which resulted in an 1886 arson of the small Chinatown on 4th Avenue. This newspaper article, published in 1885, states white Olympia residents reached a consensus to support any measures looking to a peaceable and lawful riddance of that element and a final solution for the Chinese question, which was a term used a lot of this time during these labor tensions, and it was a kind of a racial threat by the white workers against these Chinese laborers. A year after this article was published, riots and expulsions of Chinese populations in Tacoma and Seattle inspired Thurston residents to take up a similarly violent tactics in Olympia and at the railroad terminus in Tenino. The culture of racial exclusion and violence in Thurston County targeted startlingly small non-white populations. In 1920, just 3 years before the first racial covenants were certified, the Thurston census counted only 15 Black residents in the entire county. In 1950, after 1,600 covenants had been certified, the county census reported only 299 non-white residents. Although segregation was not required by law in the Pacific Northwest, as it was in the Jim Crow South, it's important to acknowledge that the Pacific Northwest practiced active and violent racial discrimination for a very long time. In counties across the state, non-white people were barred from certain neighborhoods, professions, businesses, stores, restaurants, and hospitals. Thurston County was no different. Dr. Jackson's community album includes various stories of racial discrimination, harassment, and violence faced by Black residents in our area. Thurston resident Ethel Terry recalls being denied service at the Oyster House in downtown Olympia due to the color of her skin in 1953. Avis Dennis, an engineer and Army veteran, was hired to the Washington State Highway Department in the 1940s, but forced to leave the county after enduring ongoing discrimination, culminating in a minstrel show at an office Christmas party. Other Black residents were stripped of promised jobs once employers realized their race, and those who could find employment found it almost impossible to purchase homes in desirable parts of Olympia. From the 1950s on, real estate steering meant most non-white homebuyers were predominantly or exclusively shown properties in northern Thurston County, what is now Lacey. Okay, I'm now going to highlight a few local restriction stories, a few prominent restrictors that I'm sure anyone living in the area for a while will recognize. So Fred and Coralie Carlyon were some of the first Thurston residents to impose restrictions in the county, and they certified hundreds of racial restrictive covenants between 1923 and Carlyon's death in 1956. All of the restrictions used extremely explicit racial language to bar all non-white people from occupying the platted land. This language is shown on the screen, and it was repeated. The language of Carlyon's restrictions was repeated in almost every single restriction throughout Thurston County. And this is also a really uniquely explicit restriction. Most restrictions in other counties simply say white or Caucasian only and do not have this much, like detail and racial terms in there. Today, the Carlyon North neighborhood and Carlyon Ave in Southwest Olympia still bear the name of this notorious restrictor. The Carlyon Beach neighborhood, which is located near Steamboat Island, began development under Carlyon's direction, but was completed 3 years after his death in 1959 by the Carlyon Beach Community Club, who retained these restrictive covenants in their property deeds. And this community club still operates today without acknowledgement of Carlyon's past. Okay, another prominent local restrictor was Kate Stevens Bates and her husband, James H.S. Bates. Kate Stevens Bates was the daughter of Washington's first territorial governor, Isaac Ingalls Stevens, and continued his legacy of racial violence by certifying hundreds of racially restrictive properties in Northwest Olympia and Tumwater. And you can see an example of one of these here, and you can see the restrictors on the side. The current Governor Stevens neighborhood near Olympia High School was restricted by both Kate Stevens and her brother Hazard Stevens. Olympia Federal Savings and Loan was another powerful historical institution in Thurston County, and it provided financial assistance to white residents since it was founded in 1906. The loan company restricted 105 properties in Mountain View Addition to white residents only, and shows how much power these financial institutions did have to control the makeup and success of different people in the area. It's also important to note that there were different ways that people resisted this sort of institution. The lock lending company started in the 1800s by a Chinese laborer, I forget his first name, but and provided loans to Chinese individuals and companies across the area as far as Hopium. So where there was this restriction, there was also resilience and efforts by people to support their own communities. Okay, the Schmidt family was also another prominent Olympia family who restricted properties in the area. They're most well known for starting the Olympia Brewing Company, which was a prominent industry throughout most of the 1900s. This is interesting as well because they imposed these racial restrictions, and then I learned from reading Dr. Jackson's book that they also were actively recruiting token Black employees to work there. So it was kind of this interesting balance of inclusion and exclusion there. And you can see this image also from her book of Tina Roberts Cray on the cover of the Olympia Brewing Company flyer. So even though the use of restrictive covenants was prevalent, they were not the most powerful tool of segregation. And the fact that we have found few or none in some neighborhoods does not at all mean that they were not segregated. Social means, violence, harassment, the actions of realtors, and law enforcement were the largest forces in keeping certain racial and religious groups out of certain areas. This social enforcement was often handled by real estate agents who blocked access to certain areas and by community members. Racial restrictive covenants were opposed vehemently from their onset, obviously, but they didn't gain huge political traction until the NAACP filed numerous lawsuits challenging their constitutionality. In 1948, the US Supreme Court reversed itself in the ruling of a case tried in St. Louis, asserting in Shelley v. Kramer that courts could no longer legally enforce restrictive covenants. This was very limited, though, because it only applied to courts. Because racial restrictive covenants were primarily enforced by real estate agents and property owners, because this social enforcement, this ruling did very little to change the reality of racial housing segregation. Our team has identified new restrictions certified as recently as 1968 in Snohomish County, and hundreds of new covenants were certified in Thurston County through the 1950s following the Shelley v. Kramer case. Civil rights activists in the Pacific Northwest tried with little success to change restrictive housing laws. In 1964, after 40 cities had already passed laws banning discrimination in housing, Seattle citizens voted against the measure by a rate of 2-1. This newspaper ad shown on the screen was paid for by the real estate industry and claimed that the proposed open housing law violated the property rights of white owners. Congress finally passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. This made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, or religion. And in 1969, the legislature followed up by voiding all of the past discriminatory provisions in real estate contracts. And since then, these restrictions have not been legally enforceable, but they do still sit on the property deeds of many homes in our state. In Thurston County, a fair housing campaign had been active for over a decade before the passage of this civil rights legislation. This long campaign was led by local activists, including John Finley, John Dolliver, Marge Hicks, and Virgil Clarkson, who became the first Black mayor of Lacey. The Methodist Church in Olympia was also heavily involved in these civil rights efforts. Fair housing measures were passed in Lacey and then Olympia shortly after King's assassination, and shortly before nationwide fair housing legislation was passed. Despite legal progress made in Shelley v. Kramer and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, racial violence and discrimination continue in various ways. Dr. Jackson's community album highlights various stories of real estate steering and housing violence, including property destruction and physical threats from neighbors that continued segregation practices even after they were legally renounced. Restrictive covenants and other forms of racial discrimination and exclusion have ongoing impacts on our community. As you can see in the slides, the Black population in Thurston County has historically been confined to the north of the county, away from the downtown commercial center and closer to the Lewis McChord military base. While today the Asian American population in Thurston County lives, for the most part, in all areas, the maps from 2020 show that this has been a slow and uneven process for different racial groups. While the Asian American population of Thurston County increased from 2,400 in 1980 to over 17,000 in 2020, the Black population has increased only from 1,000 to just over 9,000 in the same period. These maps and stories are not just history. These patterns of discrimination continue to produce intergenerational inequality, suppressing homeownership and wealth-building opportunities for non-white Americans who were locked out of certain government assistance programs before 1968. By the 1970s, it was too late for many non-white families to capitalize on the housing boom and government assistance. And rising prices, along with stagnating wages across the country, made it especially difficult for prospective first-generation homebuyers. The graph on the screen shows homeownership rates by race in Thurston County since 1980. You can see an alarming disparity between a stable 70% homeownership rate for white families, while Black, Latino, and Indigenous owners have consistently lagged behind. Today, nearly 70% of all white and Asian residents in Thurston County own homes, while only half of Latino and Indigenous households are owners. These trends are even more prominent and disturbing in larger counties and larger urban centers. In King County, where Seattle is, homeownership rates for Black families have fallen decade after decade. While in 1970, half of all Black families in King County owned homes, now only a staggering 28% do. This is one of the lowest homeownership rates across the country, falling far below the national average of 44%, and is actually lower than other high-priced cities, including Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. So why do we see these shocking trends? The answer is in home equity and price escalation. This graph shows the median home values by race and decade. Homes owned by Black, Indigenous, and Latino families in King County have consistently been worth less than homes owned by white families. The median home in King County has increased in value 35 times since 1970. That's an increase from about $22,000 for a home to almost $800,000. Over the same period, family incomes have only gone up by a factor of 10, so not nearly enough to keep up with this escalation unless you have family support in terms of generational wealth in housing. The point is, in the last 3 decades, buyers would need wealth to get started on homeownership, especially in larger and more expensive areas. And this wealth really only comes from inheritance or high-paying jobs. Highly paid business and professional class migrants from California, New York, and across the Pacific have been able to get in on the pricey housing market. But local residents whose families have been here for a long time, and especially those without generational housing wealth, have systemically lost out on these advantages. This disadvantage is even more shocking when we look at income level. As you can see here, there is a gap at every income level for homeownership, but this is the most at the lowest incomes. So for families making under $50,000 in King County, a shocking 38% of white families are still able to own their homes, while only 9% of Black families do. And this really shows the importance of generational wealth and giving people that push ahead to purchase a home and to have that stability and generational wealth. So now I'm going to talk about some of the good news that has come out of this research. So last year, the Washington legislature passed a pioneering law sponsored by Representatives Taylor and Chop and State Senator John Lovick. This was a first in the nation effort to provide financial compensation to victims of intergenerational government-sponsored housing discrimination. So this is a harm-based bill that under the legal principle of tort, which means if I harm you, I'm liable for those damages, those financial damages, and establishes that the state of Washington was both an active and passive participant in this discrimination that caused financial harm. The Covenant homeownership account provides compensation through mortgage assistance to families excluded from government housing assistance in the years before the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It provides no interest loans for down payments to Washington residents who were here prior to 1968 when these fair housing laws were passed and their descendants. So even if you moved away or even if your parent wasn't able to purchase a home, you could still be eligible for this. Applicants must also be first-time home buyers and their incomes must be at or below 120% of the area median. There's also a clause right now which restricts the different groups, racial and ethnic groups that can take advantage of this program. And right now, I believe it is only set to cover all African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and Korean Americans. And even more so than, marking off a restrictive covenant on a deed, this hopefully will create some actual concrete change in people's lives and in their financial situations. So as a quick summary, racial restrictive covenants were an important aspect of housing discrimination in Thurston County, but they were not the strongest tool of segregation and discrimination in our area. Thurston County has a long and prevalent history of segregation, exclusion, and racial violence. Restrictive covenants were imposed by local residents and real estate developers and are distinct from government-sponsored redlining. And the legacy of racial restrictive covenants and other means of segregation still impact our communities today. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah, totally.
Can we find these slides on the website?
Yes, there's Thurston County does not have specific slides up yet, but for King County, we have a recorded 30-minute video which goes over all of this there. And I'm also in the process of writing an essay about Thurston County, which will be published later this month if you're interested in learning more.
And we're gonna post this presentation, this meeting online on our YouTube page. And if you want a copy of this presentation, just give me your email address before you leave. Because as you see, I got it in my email.
When the counties have offered to, at no cost, to have this title modification, have there been, maybe that's have there been any that actually have gone through it in Thurston County or?
You know more about
Yes,
Thurston County.
so there have been 53 modifications filed in Thurston County since 2019. They've all come since we've begun our outreach program. We have modification forms here, we have instructions, and we have an example of a fill out modification. And please raise your hand if you're a notary. I heard there was a notary coming. Great, okay, no notary. But we can help you, fill it out and yeah. But you do need to have it notarized before you file it with our office.
How many properties to this day still have these covenants in Thurston County? Unenforceable
In
covenants.
Thurston County, we've identified at least 1,700. I believe there's been 50 of them maybe have been modified, but I know it's at least 50 more than 1,700. So I'm still going to say at least 1,700. And
That's what that is.
yeah,
Do they have to be removed one at a time, or is there a way for a governing body to enact some kind of legislation that strips all deeds? And
I mean, none of the deeds are legally enforceable anymore. That was passed in 1969. And we do hope to keep them on the historical record. So instead of just erasing it or taking away, strike through or say something like, we don't agree with this as a community anymore, but still to reflect on and recognize that this is a really important and impactful part of our history.
then the modifications, what do they actually do? They leave a trace that this used to be on the property. Could you explain that a little bit, Hannah?
Sure. So what that does when you file a modification is when that property is sold, it's basically the new recorded deed does not include those racially restrictive covenants. So it's not whitewashing history. You can always go back and look into the history of a parcel, but it breaks that chain moving forward.
So the modification request sort of puts it in queue for the next time it's sold.
Right.
And then it'll automatically, but unless the house is sold, theoretically, it could, I mean,
It still exists in the record. but
Right,
So does the
sure.
modification.
gotcha. Yeah, thank you. Sure.
Is there a way to do it without each individual requesting it on their deed?
There is one process where if it's a governing body that has itself filed the plat, because Beechcrest did this in the 1980s, that they can remove the racial covenants from their, essentially, the plat as a governing document of their organization. But in terms of the racially restrictive covenants connected to each parcel, that's up to each property owner to do.
It's like a CCR of the entire area, and so there's lots of different restrictions. The individual property owner within the group would have to agree to take off the restriction.
And is there a way do people sort of have to look into this themselves, or are they notified in some way? Like in their tax bill?
So we did an outreach program a few years ago because we found 300 on our own through plats. The research the University of Washington was much deeper, looking at individual deeds. What we're considering, and so what we did was we did a letter campaign. We knew who the property owners, because we worked with the assessor's office. We'd found addresses for all the property owners we knew had racial restrictive covenants and sent them a letter. I don't want to speak for the auditor, but I think we're going to do it again
We are.
with with the 1,700 property owners. We need to build in some infrastructure to do it. But yes, for the ones we know about, we're going to reach out to them. Yeah.
Anyone who's interested in seeing if their own property or someone they know or their area was restricted, the maps are live for Thurston County with the majority of the properties. So you can just go find your house, Google Maps, type it in, and then you could actually just view it there and know if your property was restricted.
Can you say where that is again?
Or what is, this is,
Access that.
oh yeah, yeah, look at the UW racial restrictive covenants. And then the map should be the first thing that pops up. You'll just have to navigate from King County to Thurston County.
Are there efforts like this being done in other states that you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a nationwide consortium of different projects that are working on mapping racial covenants, but Washington is the only state that has provided financial support for the project. So we're a lot further along than a lot of the other projects, and a lot of the other ones aren't connected to any sort of reparations, which Washington is doing.
Many folks have taken advantage of the zero interest loans. Is that a robust?
Yeah, it began in July of last year, and I believe the number right now is 350 people who've been able to purchase homes. And they're expecting it to be somewhere near 700 before the end of the first year of the program.
And I'm wondering how that's actually, what the outreach of that looks like, if it's financial institutions or
Yeah,
how does that?
yeah, I know that. So the Covenant Homeownership account is created with a $100 charge that's put on each property purchase in the state. And so that then goes into the account, which will renew it and allow for this down payment assistance. In terms of outreach, I think that an individual just at this point, or part of a community group or some sort of outreach organization would let you know, but otherwise, I think you have to recognize I'm eligible for this. I can prove that I was a resident or my predecessors were. Yeah.
Gotcha.
I can speak to that a little bit too. There's some flyers for that program. If you know of anyone who might benefit from that you could share. And I think there's some initiatives in Pierce County. The Black Home Initiative started a few years ago and helped get this law passed. And they are working with real estate groups and other home counseling agencies and other groups to try to do outreach at community events and get the word out. And they just recently expanded to Thurston County. So now Thurston County Realtors is a part of it, Thurston County is a part of it, we're groups. So hopefully there'll be some more local outreach to folks that might be eligible too.
Thank you.
You mentioned, the Caroline Beach development,
Mhm.
having a lot of these. Maybe it was exclusive to every property there,
Yeah.
and that there's not been an acknowledgement by the homeowners group there. You also mentioned Olympia Federal.
Mhm.
Has that, financial institution acknowledged, what it has done or publicly tried to changed its stance?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they help with the
Yes, yeah.
modification process?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so when we did the outreach program in 2021, we reached out to them to help with the notary step for folks. So they stepped forward and provided free notary services for anybody filing a modification form.
That's it.
We'll see what comes next. Yeah, and it's not uncommon for these throughout our research to find these homeowners associations, which remain primarily white today and have a very similar demographic and kind of political cultural makeup as they did when these restrictions were imposed. So not to say I haven't looked into that one, that's the case, but a lot of times we do face some resistance. And even if it's not to modifying racially restrictive covenants, it's tied to zoning and tied to all these other things, which is pretty interesting.
Can I ask, in your deed, where is that racial restriction usually land?
Yeah, let me pull up the deed and I can show you here. Okay, this is a good example right here of a deed. So they come in bound volumes like that, and then there's usually like grantor, grantee, date, etc. And then there's a set of restrictions. So often it's like no commercial activity, like they might have other restrictions, and it'll be right here in one of these little bylines. If you're interested in looking at them more closely, the Covenant's website, we do have samples for most of the large subdivisions in Thurston County that were restricted.
So I'm asking, there's not a possibility that homeowner not see this.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Yeah. These were extremely, extremely intentional, explicit. That's why I like to say Caroline died before the beach community was completed. So every single individual property owner, hundreds of them, took it upon themselves to make sure that that was still in their property deed.
Has that changed in the last 50 years then?
I mean, if we look at the kind of census maps and demographics of the area, we can see that a lot of the patterns of exclusion are still prominent today. A lot of these areas that were restricted historically, which is downtown, kind of these areas up here along the coast, still to this day in 2020 remain primarily white.
Yeah, and that's why we are doing the outreach that we are, because it is a deterrent. And yeah, I think Dr. Jackson can speak a little more to that. So,
Let me rephrase my question. So today, is Caroline Beach still one of the large pockets of housing that has these covenants still in place?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There's
Conversations to hold.
good for you.
yeah, show
That's
the
actually
maps.
that's the purpose of this, so that's fantastic. All right. Thelma Jackson. It's a great question. I really like the one about universally do that by ordinance or legislative action.
Yes.
First of all, Mary, thank you for the work of the Thurston County Auditor's Office that brings this entire topic to the forefront. I was sitting there with very mixed emotions. As I heard the report, I had been anxiously anticipating the report of the research that the university has been doing for the last few years. And they haven't realized that your office and Emmett was greatly involved. And I was appalled enough when I learned of the original 336 parcels that you had identified. And now to hear today that it's over 1,700. I just kind of had a pitfall in my stomach. And here we are in 2025 on a Saturday afternoon having to have this kind of discussion. It's extremely sad, extremely disheartening. And for me, as a Black person, having been here since 1971, 54 years now, it explains a lot about a lot. And the statement, and let me compliment you, Sophie, excellent piece of work on the part of you and your colleagues. The statement about how these things are very much still happening today. And it's a lot more subtle, a lot more covert, but I'm an eyewitness to the fact that the climate that allowed these racially restrictive covenants to come into being has not changed very much. So when your data talk about only 7 or 70 or so Blacks way back when to get our number up to now, it's amazing it's that much. Because one of the things that was made apparent to me in the research that went into this book through a process of oral interviews. And one of the questions we asked over 75 people was explain some of your earlier experiences since you've lived here in Thurston County. And invariably, the number one issue that came up for people was the lack of housing, discrimination in housing. And then as you begin to dig and realize that every interviewee had horror stories about the difficulty, but yet being a resident myself here and to hear anecdotal stories about where most of you Blacks live out in the Lacey area because you want to be near the military bases that you're affiliated with. My family is not military. Many other Blacks in the area had nothing to do with the military establishment. State government workers, federal workers, a few private sector workers. And in our research and interviewing, we came across a number of Black state employees that commuted for many years because they absolutely could not find anywhere to live in Thurston County, although they worked here for many years. So they aren't a part of this book, talking about Blacks from 1950 to 1975, because they weren't residents here. But they had stories that validated. When people talked about having to utilize the friendships of whites to be rented at least an apartment many times. It's available. It's exactly what you're looking for. Yes, there are openings. Yes, there are vacancies. And you show up to look at it. Oh, it was just taken. It's no longer available. Many stories, and many friendly white friends and colleagues that fronted for Black people to help them get places to live, apartments, houses, what have you. We had stories of people, you know, in the 70s. We're talking about the 70s, the late 70s and early 80s,
where in a community in Lacey, a family was trying to buy a home. And the homeowner was somewhat open to it, but only after he canvassed his neighborhood to get that permission. See, that kind of thing. And as we looked further into the situation, and this stops in 75, keep in mind, we're 50 years beyond 1975, and a second edition of this is long overdue. Many more Blacks have come into the area since this project ended. And people often wonder, why do most Blacks in Thurston County live in the Northeast area in Lacey? Keep in mind that the two older communities of Tumwater and Olympia had been around since the 1800s. Lacey was the new kid on the block, became a city and a municipality only in the late 60s. And they didn't have these racially restrictive covenants for the most part. And in the report, Lacey was the first one that had open housing ordinance. And so this is how Blacks were attracted to that area. They could be shown parcels, shown homes, apartments, what have you. And when you think in terms of the other practices that were going on along with the landowners and the homeowners, when you had the activities of the real estate community at a national level, of the institutions, and of the redlining. I mean, it just goes on and on and on when you begin to get this picture of systemic racism, white supremacy. And so here we are in 2025. Even though Blacks and other people of color and other indigenous people can live anywhere in Thurston County, for the most part now, if they've got the money and the resources to do so, it was not a money issue back then. It was purely racial and discriminatory. We have not overcome that. First of all, thanks to this project, we are just being exposed to the fact of just how systemic and deep and entrenched it is. And we only touched the tip of the iceberg in this book when we were wanting to look at, well, what were the impacts on the Black families, the children of those families? When you talk to the person that was the only Black kid in Olympia High School, to talk about hardly a day went by that he wasn't called nigger. And I just say nigger, I don't say the N word, because the kid wasn't saying, oh, you're the N word today. No, that's what they, no. And not to mention in the classroom, not to mention the lack of the curriculum. And so those are the kind of things we're working on in different places around here now. But it comes back to these racially restricted covenants that laid the groundwork and gave permission for the kind of attitudes and mistreatment. And when you read the language of these covenants, they are very specific about Negroes and anybody with any Negro blood. And when it goes back to the 1800s, an earlier ethnic group were Chinese. And boy, were they, you read the history of Chinese in Olympia, not somewhere else. The Native Americans, our neighbors all around us. So this is the history of this area. And most of our younger people have no idea that this is the history. Now, along comes the legislation of House Bill 1474 that was passed a few years ago. Folk like me, been here since 1971, after 1968. So what about the issue of generational wealth that has been denied? My children or grandchildren can benefit from any of these current laws because I wasn't here before 71, but that was 54 years ago. And then when you start tacking on 120% of the average income, since the numbers were so low for Blacks in Thurston County, before 68, you're going to have very few Black families that will benefit from this legislation. You see what I'm saying? And I was sitting there, Olympia Federal Savings is my mortgage lender. I wish I'd known what I know now, but what I know now, with all of the activity and conversation going around the issue of reparations, how much generational wealth have Black folk and other denied folk missed out on because of all this racist activity? How much more of a credit rating or a financial percentage were folk like my family charged? You don't know those things. If you don't know that history, you don't know those things. I just know that when my family moved here in 71, they had a heck of a time finding a house. We weren't looking for an apartment, we were looking for a house. And realtors would not show us any properties. And that's how we wound up starting out in Tangawile, like a lot of Blacks in this area did, and still do. Tangawile, different kind of developer, a different kind of mentality. And Tangawile was an open community. And that's where many of the Black GIs looking for housing off of the military bases wound up in Tangawile, not just military people. But right now, Lacey has the highest percentage of Blacks of any of the jurisdictions in Thurston County. But now you have to come to the conclusion that it is not by accident. It was by design. It was by design. And so I'm anxious. I won't say excited because that has kind of a positive word to it. I'm anxious to find out about some of these other 1,400 properties, in addition to the 336 that I knew about from the earlier study of Emmett and his staff there at the county auditor. You never know. You never know, but it explains a lot. It explains a lot. So when we think in terms of the earlier Blacks who came to this area in the 50s, the 60s, and they tell stories of the crosses being burned on lawns and the meanness and the vandalism to their homes and all this kind of stuff. You can see why now. Because of the climate and the environment that was very prevalent. And a lot more to keep up with as far as the numbers of Blacks in Thurston County. We aren't just in Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater anymore. We're in Yelm, Bucota, Rochester, or you name it. And if some of those restrictive covenants are out there in the rural area too, people are moving south from Pierce County, and they landed in Pierce County, moving from King County, and so a lot more people are in this area now than used to be. And I wish we had the wherewithal to be able to track what kind of obstacles are they currently encountering when it comes to trying to buy property, build a home, find a affordable, there's a lot going on. And a lot more that needs to go on, obviously. So Olympia Federal provide free notary.
Yeah.
Whoopee! Whoopee! That's information. And it's not just Olympia Federal. It's the credit unions, WSECU. You look at the people who were sponsors of the Black Home Initiative. And you could just about tell who's the guiltiest victim because they're making the biggest contributions, the Wells Fargos, the key banks, you know. But we have some educating to do of our community, our entire community. We have to make sure that those historical practices aren't still in place subtly, you know, lower key, but still in place. We have to make sure of that. Because one of the things we as a community, we've unilaterally endorsed the whole concept of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I'm constantly saying, as a member of the Lacey Equity Commission, how much of this is just rhetoric? How much of these are just words? And there's a lot going on. And it goes very deep. You take that deeper dive and you get more and more concerned about what your mining is coming up with. So either we're a community that embrace the concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the B been added on, belonging. It's more than just a slogan. It's more than just a slogan. And Black folk and Asians, predominantly Chinese, are no longer the two most abused minority groups. We truly are a side bowl of people in Thurston County now. And we talk about homelessness all the time, which is very visible as you're driving up and down the road and you see the tents. But it's more to it than that. It's more to it than that. So we have some difficult conversations ahead. We have some difficult work ahead. We're living in a political time where people are, you know, really questioning their own values and beliefs and abandoning them in many instances. Well, we as a community cannot afford to do that. We cannot. But what are we going to do about it? The threats, the intimidation, and all of that kind of thing. If you don't do this, we will do this to you. If you don't consent to do this, we're going to withhold that from you. All of that is going on in the context of this new conversation around reparations that we must have. And the reparations we're talking about now, for the most part, is for enslavement in America. But right here, we can talk about reparations for denied generational wealth due to racially restricted covenants. We can bring it right on down home. So you're going to be hearing a lot of reference to reparations, and I applaud my colleague, Mayor of Olympia, who introduced the reparations resolution and was very active in the participation of the reparations bill that passed the recent session of the legislation that only calls for a study, a $300,000 study on the impacts of reparation and how does this state go forward in trying to make amends for it. But it was a beginning. Small beginning, but a beginning. Thank you. Many, many hours of work on the part of many, many people. Many, many people, including my husband, Nat, that didn't allow me to go to sleep on any of those discussions, and 7 a.m. Saturday morning conference calls. And but most people don't even know that those conversations were taking place or that that bill just passed. And the significance of it is the fact that here's a $300,000 budget appropriation at a time when the state is facing a $30 billion deficit. It was no easy lift, believe you me, but it was a beginning. And it has an element in it that says the group working on this can resort to private sector money to augment this piddly $300,000. So at least it's not limited to that. So the Olympia Federals of the world, here we come. All right, okay? And I'm referencing them only because they were specifically referenced in the presentation, but it is not limited to them. The credit unions, financial institutions, period. And so most of them thought they had gotten away with it. But thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, download this report. Let's make it public. Let's start asking around. Am I living on a parcel with a racially restricted covenant that I didn't know? Where do I sign up? Where's the notary I need? Where do I sign? So we have to get serious about this. We have to get serious about this. How many redlining practices are still taking place? Maybe it's called by some other name right now, but I mean, the bottom line is still the same. So I appreciate the inclusion on this presentation today. And I'll have to think about where do I go from here on this journey. It becomes an individual thing. Where do I go from here? What do I do with book 2 from 1976 to 2025? The 50 years that's passed by. It's a daunting task, but it all goes hand in hand so that we have the most accurate picture possible of what kind of community do we live in, what kind of environment are we a part of, and where there is work to do, that many people must step forward and be partakers of the challenge ahead of us. So thank you. Questions? Questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for all of your comments and helping us understand, all of you, the whole panel, understanding what's been going on in Thurston County. And then I just want to make a remark. Habitat for Humanity charges no down payment for people moving into those homes. They have to meet their income requirement, but there's no down payment. And as I've worked on that houses for years, I see people of all walks move into those houses. And it's been heartwarming to see families get the keys for the house and, they finally have a house to live in. And Olympia has, I think, donated or at least made available property to build some more homes in this community under that regime of no down payment. Well, they make a down payment. They have to put in sweat equity. But anyway, thank you for your presentation, all of you. Thanks.
Thank you for the comment. Any others? Questions, comments? Dante?
I have some comments. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Jackson. The work that I've done on reparations could only happen because you were leading the way in this area long before I even arrived. So can we give her another hand? Did want to let you all know that Olympia City Council will be having a study session on reparations in June. So next month on June 24th. So you are welcome to either watch online or come in person to hear our discussion on that topic. And I just wanted to say, I actually got a little bit teary-eyed sitting here because as we were talking about the impact of these covenants, it just occurred to me that this could be part of the reason it took 164 years for somebody like me to be mayor.
Yeah.
And I never thought of it that way. So I'm sitting with that. And so I thank everyone that's here. Thank you, Auditor Hall, Emmett, Sophie, thank you for your work. And thank you all for being. Thank you.
I'd just like to close by saying, I appreciated Dr. Jackson's question of what are we going to do moving forward? And I know one of the things that was going through my mind, because I live in an HOA, which I don't recommend, I'm going to look at our bylaws, our covenants, and I'm sure it's not in there because it's a fairly new community, but I'm gonna reach out and start a campaign that they actually add something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things I would like to ask everybody to do also, we've got to quit saying DEI. People don't know what that means. We need to say diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can anybody argue with that? People can argue with DEI. They can't argue with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
But they do, Mary.
Yeah, they do that.
You mean they do?
Yeah, I'm sure, and we all have a lot of work to do. I am so grateful to see all of these faces here. You know, this is a struggle that is ongoing. There are veiled solutions, but it really hasn't addressed the problem. And it's going to take every single one of us to be steadfast in these efforts and do everything that we can. And I can assure you, we're going to be working as hard as we can in our office to get these modifications filed. And Brad, I appreciate your statement of reaching out to people that you know and asking the questions. And I think that's an important step also. And there was an earlier comment made of, you know, could there be a blanket solution? You know, Commissioner Grant, that would be an interesting thing, and Mayor Payne to look at. Is there something that could be done through ordinance or legislation or something like that? But I think making sure this is being discussed in our community is going to be an important step moving forward.
That just brought up for me one quick comment, is I really appreciate what you have said about, we're not trying to whitewash this over. We don't want to remove it from history. People need to know that it was there, and then it needs to be fixed.
Yes.
So whatever blanket solution comes up, it's not to erase the documentation in the past and what was here. It needs to be, yes, going forward, if there's a way to do that. But let's not try to say, oh, no, it never happened. It never happened, because, you know, 15 years from now, people are gonna say, look, it never happened in Thurston County.
And
History is history.
thank you for saying that, because Emmett can attest to the fact that we had a real struggle in the Auditors Association, the debate over, do we go back and white out everything? And yeah, I got pretty excited about that discussion, and that's like erasing the Holocaust, right? I mean, history needs to remain, and people need to be able to go back and look at the ugly history we have. So,
Can I make a point
yes.
with regard to the blanket? Well, overview of, there's no accountability. There's no individual accountability. And that is erased when you make a blanket get out of jail card for everybody. If you are aware that there was a racial restrictive covenant, it is your responsibility to come forth and correct it. And that should be a part of our education system, of bringing awareness from our youngest to our graduates of high school. This is what has happened. This is why you have bullying. You have all of these things that are happening to Black children. It's because of this as a basis that happened from 1850, actually before that. So there's a history that needs to be acknowledged, it needs to be accounted for, and it needs to be corrected measures.
An excellent point.
I'd like to, yeah, second that as well. And a lot of our modification efforts also with the project in King County, we found it in like taking away or modifying a restriction does in reality absolutely nothing to change the culture of an area. It doesn't change people's views on white supremacy, and it doesn't even really force them to do anything to acknowledge the harm that they and their families have caused in the past. So I think that even by a person acknowledging this is on my property and taking the time to think about it and get rid of that, instead of the county just saying, oh, like, we're not okay with this, make the individual acknowledge it, and then also think, what can I do beyond just changing this? What can I do in terms of personal reparations? How do I think about zoning in my city? How do I think about different infrastructure projects, different housing projects, stuff like that? You can say, oh, I'm against redlining, I'm against racial restrictive covenants, but still support the exact same policies that were in place then through different language. So I think that's an important thing to note too.
Mary. Well, and I thank you for this, and thank you, Dr. Jackson. Been great. This is an amazing research. It was so well put together, methodical to really tell the story. I'll just say kind of like what you had said. This, you saw me cry. I cry a lot. I'm just a crier. But I also been here my whole life, and I'm 50 years old. And my parents came in 1968 to start Evergreen State College, and in 1970, they're white. They adopted a little black boy. That's my brother. And moved to Shelton. And so I had a black brother. And then they adopted me in 1975, and they were just like, they just picked a brown baby. And then they brought this little brown girl home. And when I was just telling the story to someone the other day, and I said there were 7 of us. And, I could count on our hands the 7 of us that were dark in my school. And that was it. And people, my kids never believe me when I say that, but that was it. And from the time I started till the time I graduated, and now I understand why, and this is just incredible. My office, and I'll do what I can, Mary, you and I can work together to figure out what you and I can do to just make this visible and make this loud. It's just, I'm really, I'm glad that I came. I'm glad all of you came, and we'll see what we can do on the commissioner's side of things.
Dr. Jackson. One activity that's underway all over right now is every municipality is looking at their 20-year comprehensive plans.
Yes.
And with the Lacey Equity Commission, we're looking at it through an equity lens as those drafts come to us. Housing, transportation, environment, ecology, the whole thing. And we want to see language that talks about equity, inclusion, and make sure that some of the policies that are going to be adopted for the next 20 years aren't furthering the exclusion versus the inclusion. Every city, the county, everybody, it's a state law. It caps only once every 20 years. And many public input sessions are happening right now and reviews of those drafts. Now is a good time to peruse those, looking for evidence that some of these racially exclusive policies aren't being perpetuated into the next 20 years.
Well, the Growth Management Act, that speaks to the quality of life for all citizens. And that should stay like that. And big business, and we understand, government segregation, for example. This is the business model. This is industry's version of restrictions and segregation, racism, that is subtle. It is subtle, like you say, but it is in the air. It still is in the air. You talk about a climate, talk about an environment, it's still in the air. And it's a business model. So is, maybe Nazi Germany too. These were business models that are very, very dangerous. And they are perpetuated and there is guilt. There's guilt with real estate agents. And maybe that still occurs as a business model. So collective guilt, the good feeling with those people that managed to get to that point and could feel guilty for the past and bad things that have happened. Unfortunately, there's an enormous amount of responsibility with that. And the jurisdictions, I think, somehow need to do their part much greater. However you may be able to do so. The Growth Management Act is becoming dismantled. That's one of the things that's happening. So all sorts of, the quality of life goes down for everybody. And then people that have already been damaged, already been oppressed, they're gonna get worse and worse with regard to that. So the Growth Management Act is really very important. We need to stick with that, and all the RCWs, they're great. The RCWs are great. We just need to not have them taken apart and usurped and destroyed. So stick to the RCWs and we can start getting out there.
And I would like to see, instead of all citizens, all residents.
Right, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.